Welcome to another episode of Primetime Live here on Jess FM and Jess TV. I am your host, James Cousineau. Normally, we would start the show with a news recap from Lethbridge and then across Canada and around the globe. We're going to forego our news summary and our news report this week because we have a very important topic in which we are going to explore. We're going to look at mass violence, the acts of school shootings, as well as workplace violence and community events that have been attacked over the last year and even longer. Now, of course, this has become a real issue throughout the United States, and it seems to be picking up steam as there seems to be more divisiveness and polarization within the communities in the United States. This does not, however, mean that other nations are free from the violence and the mass acts. We've seen where vehicles have been used in Germany, in Canada, and other countries as well. So it's not just the guns that are the issue when it comes to the violence that's plaguing our communities. However, with that said, of course, we do know that there has been an increase in the number of different types of crime, including schools and places of worship. And then, of course, we see different acts of violence within workplaces. So as we continue on the program today, we will be exploring a bunch of these different issues and looking to see what's going on. Now, on the morning of August the 27th, 2025, it began like any other Wednesday at this school in Minnesota. Now, the Annunciation Catholic Church in Minneapolis, inside the familiar rituals of the school mass were underway. And sorry, I'm just going to check that there and turn our volume down a little. There we go. All right. So, as I was saying, my apologies, that the mass were underway, and that's a cornerstone of the community that is also home to an elementary school. The peace was shattered by the groundbreaking echoes of gunfire within the facility and outside. A man armed with 3 guns fired dozens of rounds through the church windows, turning a place of sanctuary into a scene of unimaginable horror. When the attack ended, 2 children aged 8 and 10 were deceased. 21 other people, most of them children, were injured. Now, the shooter, a 21-year-old man, was later found deceased at the rear of the church, having taken his own life. The immediate aftermath of such a tragedy, the questions are always the same. How could this happen? How did it happen? And why did it happen? And of course, the shock will recede. And as that happens, a familiar haunting pattern emerges. A trail of missed signals, overlooked warnings, and disconnected clues come into focus, creating a clear picture that is not only visible in hindsight, is only visible in hindsight, but again, if people were more aware of warning signs and indicators, these types of acts of violence almost always could be prevented. Now, as we continue on here, we're going to take a look at many of those ways in which it could be prevented in the future. But again, it's very little hope for those who are dealing with it now. As we continue on, of course, we know that the immediate aftermath is always a knee-jerk reaction and upset by everyone in the various communities. But at the end of the day, it's all about practicality and trying to find solutions that work long-term. Bear with me a moment, folks. I think we might have a quick screen issue I just got to deal with here. Nope, we don't want that. We want this one. Sorry, I'm just looking at the screen here, and it looks like it might be a wrong setting. So I'm just going to keep going here as I try to fix that issue with it. All right, well, we'll see how that works anyway. But at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, of course, the trail of mixed signals is very, very important. Now, as we go on through the episode today, we're going to look at the central paradox of mass violence. And these are rarely sudden, inexplicable events or acts of snapping, as people refer to it. Instead, they're a culmination of a discernible process, what experts call a pathway to violence. The signs are almost always there, but they are only assembled in a coherent, tragic narrative after the damage is done. Understanding this pathway is the first step forward to shifting our collective focus from negative grief to proactive prevention. Now, I'm just going to check here. We seem to have lost Jesse, so I'm going to see if I can't bring him back here. We don't know where he went. So in any event, as we talk about that, there we go, that's better. Now, bear with me, or just responding here. So yes, if you have any questions or you want to jump into the conversation at any time, please feel free to use the chat, or you can also call in and you can see that, or sorry, you can do that either via WhatsApp or telephone. The number is 368-997-6741. Once again, if you want to call in live on the show or through WhatsApp, you can do so calling 1-368-997-6741. And as we continue on, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a look at the pathway to violence. And that is, of course, an essential part of understanding and trying to uncouple this massive violence that we see throughout the US. But again, as it perpetrates and permeates into the international media, of course, it does have an impact on the rest of the globe in terms of the desensitization towards school violence, workplace violence, and community violence. So this is an impact that goes global. It's not just isolated to one region or one nation. Now, before we continue, I just want to mention that this program is brought to you by Carry Movers Limited. For over 20 years, Carry Movers has been helping families move safely into their new homes because every family deserves to feel secure in their community. Their commitment to careful planning and accountability reminds us all, with foresight and attention to detail, we can navigate life's most stressful transitions. Learn more at www.carrymovers.com. That's K-A-R-Y movers.com. And thank you for their sponsorship of yet another episode of Primetime Live here on Jess FM. Now, the notion that perpetrators of mass violence simply snap is a dangerous myth. Now, people use that term often, and it's not actually the case. And although they may reach a breaking point, they don't just suddenly snap. Now, research from law enforcement and behavioral scientists has consistently shown that these are planned events preceded by a period of ideation, preparation, and observable changes in behavior. Now, recognizing these stages transforms prevention from an impossible exercise in mind reading to a public health imperative focused on identifying and responding to clear signals of distress. Now, this is applicable both in the public realm, in communities, workplaces, and also within the school settings. Now, let's take a look at the anatomy of a grievance. Now, the pathway to violence almost invariably begins with a grievance. Attackers are often motivated by a profound and deeply held sense of injustice, which can be rooted in personal, professional, or financial setbacks. These are not abstract political motivations, but intensely personal feelings of being wronged. Now, common themes include a belief that they have been treated unfairly, that no one cares, and a feeling of being personally victimized through bullying, persecution, or injury by others. In some cases, this extends to a belief that a group with which they identify has been victimized. Now, this sense of grievance is often compounded by an inability to cope with losses or personal failures, leading to what observers may describe as a downward spiral. spiral, sorry. An FBI study of active shooters found that most common grievances were related to adverse interpersonal actions and adverse employment actions. Now, when you look at interpersonal, that represents about 33%. When you look at adverse employment actions, you're looking at about 18%. Now, this finding underscores that the seeds of violence are often sown in the attacker's immediate social and professional environment, in conflict with peers, romantic partners, or employers. Now, of course, when you look at the constellation of warning signs, that too is an important part to look at. Now, while a grievance provides the motive, it's the emergence of a cluster of concerning behaviors that signals a person may be moving down the path to violence. No single sign is, of course, definitive, but when multiple indicators appear together, they form a recognizable pattern. And that is a very poignant pattern of risk. Now, these signs can be coupled into several categories. And I'm going to bring that up on the screen here so that you can follow along with these as well. So again, we look at a lot of the different variables and a lot of the different contributing factors. Now, one in itself does not necessarily mean that somebody is going to act out in a mass act of violence, but when you combine several of these, then of course you may have concern. One of the biggest problems we see is that people are afraid to speak out because they may be wrong. They don't want to face an embarrassment, humiliation, or even just embarrass their colleagues or friends or associates, whatever the case is, and therefore they fail to speak out until it is too late. Now let's start with taking a look at behavioral and emotional indicators, and I've brought it up on the screen for you that one of the most common signs is increasing social isolation and withdrawal from friends, family, and activities. This is often accompanied by a decreased performance at work or school, a pervasive sense of hopelessness, and a marked increase in mental health symptoms such as depression, anxiety, paranoia, or or psychosis. Now, suicidal ideation or prior attempts are particularly strong warning signs as well. Now, let's take a look at the ideations and interests. That would be looking at a shift of interests that can also be a red flag. This includes a dramatically increased or obsessive interest in past mass attacks or attackers, and a new or inappropriate interest in obtaining weapons or explosives and the purchase of tactical gear. This is a major red flag if the individual has not been involved in these areas previously, such as, recreational hunting or shooting and such, and all of a sudden they have a huge interest in those things. Now, the individual may begin expressing homicidal ideations or fantasies about violently hurting others. They may say that out loud, they may subtly bring it up, or they may be within their social media structure putting things out that increase in terms of the concern over time. Now, stressors also play into the issue, and these behavioral changes often occur in the context of significant life stressors. Now, the FBI found that active shooters typically experienced multiple stressors in the year before their attack. Most common were related to mental health, and that's rating at about 62%. Financial strain comes in at about 49%, and job-related issues at 35%. So that gives you a good indicator there. Now, of course, there's also conflicts with peers and friends, which comes in about 29% in terms of the overall stressors. Now, these stressors act as catalysts, exacerbating the underlying grievances and pushing the individual further down the pathway. When you look at these ideations and these final stages, when it goes from ideation to action, we're going to take a look here at the transition from thinking about violence to actively preparing for it. and that is marked by the most critical and time-sensitive warning signs. Now, again, these can apply to youth, they can apply to adults and others. So again, it's a very important factor to look at in the totality of warning signs and indicators. Now, mass attacks are not impulsive. Research shows that attackers spend considerable time planning, with nearly half of active shooters spending a week or longer on preparation. The phase can involve researching potential targets online, conducting physical reconnaissance. They can be looking at testing security and stockpiling weapons, ammunition, or materials for improvised explosive devices. Again, very, very clear warning signs and indicators. Now, of course, there are legacy tokens as well that they're referred to, and that's a clear indicator that an attack may be imminent if the creation of a legacy token, a manifesto, a video, a suicide note intended to be found after the attack that gets either found after, but people that may notice these things earlier and don't speak out. Now, these documents are created to explain the attacker's motives and or to claim credit for the violence. The creation of a legacy token also often signifies that the individual has moved beyond fantasy and is now planning for the final act and the narrative that will surround it. So again, very important if you are finding such information or content on someone's computer that you care about, especially for parents of teenagers or children, it's a very big sign. Perhaps the most consistent actionable warning sign that's been identified by research is what's called leakage. Now, leakage is communication of intent to commit violence by a third party. Now, this, of course, can be a direct threat. This direct threat, again, is made by or shared with family members, and friends, classmates, online acquaintances, co-workers, and it doesn't have to be very direct. It can also be a subtle hint shared with those people. And again, they found, the studies that is, have repeatedly found that in the majority of school shootings and other mass attacks, scared to main. So we're just looking at a technical issue here, folks. We'll just see what we can do about that. Let's see. Bear with me one moment, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see what we can do here. I am just adjusting the screen, folks. If you don't mind just bearing with me for a moment while we do this, we'll just see what we can do here. Just maximize this. So in any event, data from the FBI confirms this phenomenon, and that again is a major issue. So we are looking to try and bring this forward and to make sure that people have tools that they can use. And where did we go there? Bear with me, folks. We just had a quick technical issue I am just dealing with here, so bear with me one quick moment, and we'll get rid of that if we can. Bear with me a moment there. We'll see what's going on here. Okay, well, we'll just continue on. We'll have to deal with, we've switched to a new streaming format and platform, folks. So we are just working out a few of the kinks here. So I apologize if you are finding that there are a few kinks on your screen, and we'll just work that out as we go. But in the interest of time, we're going to keep moving along here. Bear with me one moment as I do that. Now, of course, when we talk about this, we're talking about the different findings that come into play. And that's that 56% of active shooters displayed what is called the leakage, or leaking information beforehand. Now, as I said, this is a big concern because not only overall do they look at 56% of active shooters. When you actually transfer that to focusing in on individual students and youth for school violence, it actually comes up at a much greater level, and that is up around 80%. So again, that is showing how much leakage there is and how many warning signs that can be present even though it's not seen right away. So again, you see that on the screen there. As we look though, it's a concerning behavior, and the most tragic aspect of this finding is that the case studies and the ones particularly studied in this matter was that these warnings were almost never reported to law enforcement. This points to critical failure, not just in identifying a potential attacker, but in our collective response to clear signals of intent. When leakage occurs, this threat assessment model provides a framework for evaluating the risk by examining the specificity of the threat. Does it include details of who, what, when, where, and how, and the plausibility of the context? Now, there's also the high prevalence of leakage combined with the fact that a significant number of attackers are suicidal at the time of their attack, suggesting a profound duality at play. The communication of a violent plan may not only be a threat, it can also be interpreted as a final, deeply dysfunctional cry for help. An individual steeped in hopelessness and isolation may share their intention in the faint hope that someone will intervene and stop them. The attack becomes the final act in life that they no longer wish to live. The leakage is so important, and the leakage is the last door left ajar for an alternative outcome. This reframes the problem from purely security focused issue into a public health crisis. Now, this is especially important as more and more mental health budgets from different governments in all different nations seem to be getting cut left, right, and center, and a reduction in service models that's being introduced. So, again, we have to reevaluate that and look at the for politicians, look at the cost risk analysis. When you spend the money on prevention and intervention, you are therefore saving money on A, you're saving lives. B, you are helping people to feel more secure and to get the help they need, reducing in lost productivity in the workplace and the overall GDP. When you also calculate in the lost days of student attentiveness at school, they also will contribute to cost savings if you're looking at it from specifically that angle. The reason why is because when students stay home, a lot of times that impacts their parents' workplace schedule or other things to that nature, but also the other associated costs. Now, the failure of those who hear the leaks to actually report them points to a massive societal bystander intervention gap. And that's what we refer to that, or the BIG. It's a big problem, right? Now, people may fail to act for many reasons, and that's a fear of being wrong. We talked about that right at the top of the show. There's also the fear of retaliation. There is uncertainty about who to tell, or a tendency to normalize threatening language as mere venting. Now, this implies that one of the most effective prevention strategies is not just teaching people to recognize the signs in the attacker, but also closing this intervention gap. This requires robust public education campaigns and the creation of clear and accessible programs and non-punitive reporting channels, such as the behavioral threat assessment teams used in some communities. Now, the challenge is not only that attackers send signals, but that our society systems and our social systems are not adequately equipped to receive and act upon them. So again, so many times that there are warning signs and indicators. So up on your screen there, you can see the illusion of unpredictability, this slide here. And again, instead of looking at the workplace setting or overall in terms of the leakage, this one here focuses on the school acts of violence and mass acts of violence within the school systems in the USA. Now, as you can see on the screen there, a pervasive myth, as we said, suggests mass violence erupts without warning, but in reality, and analysis of past tragedies, it reveals a constant pattern. And again, 80% of school shooters told someone in their circle, whether it was family, friends, uh, other students, whatever the case is, they actually said it out loud or online to others before they acted. And that again is what we call the last cry for help before they enact such a plan. Now, of course, the 90% of attackers engaged in concerning prior behaviors. And again, we're looking at those behaviors throughout the program today. So we will continue looking at this as we go, but we're going to take a look at the global epidemic and the data from 2025 thus far. This is important to look at, as a lot of times the studies are looking backwards facing. So again, we can look at more current information. And again, not all of these incidents have all of the data available in terms of more recent attacks or episodes that have happened. So we need to be cautious with that as we present the most recent information, and at the same time respecting that there may still be some factors that haven't been brought in on that level yet. So we'll take a look at it as we go here. Now, the abstract concept in terms of the global reality of it is that a pathway to violence becomes tragically concrete when examined through the lens of real world data. The year 2025 has been marked by a relentless series of mass casualty events, both in the United States and globally. So again, we're looking at Canada, we're looking at the UK, we're looking at Australia, we're looking at the entire globe here. Now, while the US remains a stark outlier, in particular with this struggle and firearms violence, the data reveals that the impulse towards mass violence is a global phenomenon and that it manifests in different but equally devastating ways. On the screen now, you can see a breakdown of countries. So in terms of numbers of attacks from 2000 to 2025, you can see how far that the US is ahead of France, Germany, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And even when you combine all of these other countries, the US still is in a huge way much more susceptible. Now, the American reality, let's take a look at that. In the United States in 2025, it has continued a grim trend, and it's continuing this pattern of frequent mass shootings. The definition of a mass shooting can vary, which complicates data correlation and collection. Some sources count incidents with 4 or more people killed, while others count incidents with 4 or more people shot. Now, that includes the injured. So again, it shows that variance in the numbers. Now, regardless of the definition, the scale of the problem is staggering. As of August 31st, 2025, one database cataloged 309 mass shootings defined by 4 or more victims shot, which resulted in 302 deaths and 1,354 injuries. Another prominent source, the Gun Violence Archive, reported 293 such incidents by early September. These incidents and events have occurred in communities across the country, from major cities to small towns. So don't think that because you're in a small town, you are isolated. Let's take a quick peek at some of these incidents more directly. Now, August the 27th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are familiar with that most recent one. There were 3 fatalities and 21 injuries when a gunman fired into a school mass at Annunciation Catholic Church, killing 2 children and injuring 21 others, mostly children, before taking his own life. July 28th in New York City. Yes, in New York, 5 people, and that was fatalities, with additionally 2 more injured, when a man opened fire in a Midtown Manhattan office building, killing 4 people, including a police officer, before killing himself. Now, that attack was believed to be targeting the NFL headquarters. In terms of Houston, Texas, on July the 13th, 2 people were killed and 15 others injured. A drive-by shooting outside a nightclub that wounded 17 people in total. 2 of them, as I said, were fatally injured there. Lexington, Kentucky, July 13th, a man shot a state trooper, hijacked a vehicle, and then attacked a church, killing 2 people before being killed by responding officers. Again, 3 people in total were killed there, with 2 additional injured. July the 7th in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the gunfight in the Grays Ferry neighborhood killed 3 people and wounded 9 others, including 2 juveniles. Once again, 3 people killed, 9 injured on top of that. Now, let's take a look at July the 2nd in Chicago, Illinois, where 4 people were killed and 14 others injured in another drive-by shooting that occurred outside a restaurant in the River North neighborhood during a rapper's album release party. So again, we could go on for the next hour or several hours talking about all of the different variables and all of the different ones that have happened. But again, this just gives you a bit of a insight into that. So again, we will leave that in terms of looking at the overall. But let's take a look at the various spots around the world and give some global context and comparison here. And that, of course, is a big issue as well, because we know that even though there are tough gun laws in many nations, that does not mean that there are not attacks. It does not mean that there are not issues that happen. So let's take a look at that. Now, there was, on June the 10th, the school shooting in Austria, and a former student had opened fire at a school in the city or town of Graz, Austria, killing 10 people and injuring 11. The attack was the worst school shooting in the nation's history, and a tragic reminder that no country is immune to this. And meanwhile, here in Canada, on September the 4th, the man went on a stabbing spree on the Hollow Water First Nations community in Manitoba. He killed his 18-year-old sister and injured 7 others before dying in a collision with a police vehicle. This event is indicative of a broader trend where mass violence in countries with strict gun laws is often carried out with blades or other weapons. Now, there was the vehicular attack in the U.S. on January the 1st. A man drove his pickup truck into a crowd of New Year's revelers on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, killing 15 people and injuring 57. The attack was investigated as an act of domestic terrorism inspired by ISIS, demonstrating the continued evolution of this deadly tactic. There's also the worry of global conflict and terrorism, and that's beyond these isolated attacks. Mass casualties are a daily reality in conflict zones. The 2025 Global Terrorism Index reported that 98% of all terrorism-related deaths occur in active conflicts, but that also leaves 2% that happen outside of the actual conflict zones. Now, as I said, it's just looking at places such as the Sahel region of Africa and other areas that there is just ongoing conflict, and there's other places like Syria, Gaza, Somalia, Ukraine, and so forth. And that is also playing in because of, once again, we are seeing where the world is kind of getting normalized, if I dare use that word, to acts of violence around the world, whether it is through the current state of disarray, whether it's, again, in Syria or these other nations. It really plays a role when you look at the mental health of people who are susceptible to the violence already, and they see this happening. They may feel slighted as seeing their home nation or a group of people, maybe religious group or such, that they may feel slighted by. This again plays into homeland security issues and mass acts of violence in Canada, in the US, in the UK, I can go on and on. But again, the cross-national comparison of these events reveals a clear pattern, and that is the method of mass violence is largely dictated by the availability of the weapon. In the United States, for example, where firearms are widely accessible, the mass shooting is the predominant form of attack. In nations such as here in Canada and the United Kingdom, which have stringent gun laws, mass stabbings are more common. Now, in Europe, where both guns and large vehicles are accessible, but guns are more regulated than in the US, vehicle ramming has emerged as a prominent terrorist tactic. We've seen this here in Canada, we've seen it in the US, we've seen it in the UK, we've seen it in Germany and elsewhere. So again, it's becoming more prevalent as well. And this demonstrates that while the underlying impulse the mass violence may be universal, the lethality and scale of the resulting attack are closely and directly correlated with the efficiency of the chosen weapons. Now, yes, some people may bring up a point that Canada does still have a lot of weapons. And in fact, it has been, as a couple of years ago, Canada actually had more guns per capita than the US. However, the types of weapons are a major contributing factor. A lot of Canadians do have weapons for hunting purposes. They are, rifles and such. They are not automatic weapons, long guns and, Berettas and things like that. So again, it makes a big difference as well because of the fact of the size of cartridge and magazines that they are feeding into these automatic weapons in the US. Now, when adjusted for the population, the data starkly illustrates the United States' unique position among high-income nations. The US has an age-adjusted firearm homicide rate that is 33 times greater than Australia and 77 times greater than Germany's, while the overall US gun death rate of 13.7 per 100,000 people in 2023 was below the 1974 peak, and the firearm homicide rate remains an extreme outlier for a developed country. Data from the global monitors like the Small Arms Survey and the Global Violent Deaths Database further contextualize this figure, showing that while many countries have higher overall homicide rates, the US rate of firearm-related homicide is unparalleled in the developed world. So again, when you look at that, and when I talk about among high-income nations, that plays a role into it as well. But again, we're talking developed nations, or what they also refer to as high-income nations. So again, these are huge, huge contributing factors that we see. Now, when it comes to the search for solutions, it's policy and prevention. But again, there are so many other ways in which we can look at reducing the number of injuries and the large number of people in these mass attacks. Now, as we continue on to look at this, of course, we also need to make sure. Sorry, folks, I'm just looking here. There we go. Sorry, I just had to check a technical thing. But again, folks, if you want to talk about this issue, call in. The number is 1-368-997-6741. Please call in. If you want to call in on WhatsApp, you can also do that as well. And the same number applies on WhatsApp. So again, 1-368-997-6741. The phone lines are open, and I'm just clicking here to make sure our WhatsApp is active so that you can call in and be a part of the conversation. Have you had experience with violence? Have you got solutions for violence? Whatever the case is, by all means, feel free to call in or to come on to WhatsApp with your comments. Of course, with that said, don't forget that the chat room and the chat is alive. So if you want to chat as well on the chat forums, you're welcome to do that. Now let's get back to legislating safety and the evidence on gun laws. Yes, there are different studies that come out and there's different opinions, but the fact is that when we look at the actual evidence of it around gun control, it's often broad and ideological. However, the research into specific types of laws reveals significant differences in their effectiveness. So let's take a look at some of these, and I'll bring them up on the screen as I did with other parts here so that you can follow along with these areas. So let's just pull that up and you can follow along here. So let's go there, and we should be sharing. That's it. So as I said, the limit of background checks. Okay, so there are limitations here. Now, comprehensive background checks can cover private sales that are widely supported. The state level studies on their standalone effectiveness have produced inconsistent or no results in reducing overall firearms violence and fatalities. This suggests that simply requiring a check at a point of sale may not be sufficient to deter those who acquire firearms, and through no other means, or to identify all high risk individuals. Keeping in mind that a lot of mass shooters may not have a real criminal record. Whether it's school shootings, of course, we're looking at youth and such, but there are warning signs. And don't get me wrong, some do have criminal records, but again, it's not always an indicator. Now, when you look at other areas, now specifically, we're talking about mass violent attacks here. We're not talking about domestic violence, which is a different factor in itself. And that's something that maybe we'll cover on another program. But again, we're talking about the acts of mass shootings and mass acts of violence for this particular episode. Now, the efficacy of firearm purchaser program, and that's also referred to as the FPL. So let's take a look at that, because in contrast, a growing body of evidence points to the effectiveness of the FPL. Now, these laws are requiring prospective buyers to first apply for and obtain a license from a state or local law enforcement agency before they can legally even purchase the firearm. Research consistently links the FPLs and the laws to significant reductions in gun violence. A 2020 study found that states with strong handgun licensing laws were associated with 56% fewer fatal mass shooting incidents and 67 fewer mass shooting victims. A separate analysis found that Connecticut's FPL law was associated with a 28% reduction in its firearms homicide rate. Now, of course, the effectiveness of the FPL laws stems from their design. They focus, instead of just a simple background check, to requiring different processes here. Now, the entire process of becoming a gun owner is impacted, and it's not just on the final moment of sale. Now, by requiring an in-person application, fingerprinting, and a more thorough background check that includes state and local records that are often missed by the federal system, the FPLs create a more robust and multi-layered vetting process. This built-in waiting period also allows more time for disqualifying information to surface and may act as a cooling off period for individuals in crisis. So it gives them the opportunity that they may be able to get help or find someone to intervene prior to them actually getting fully through this time-consuming process. And it's not an overly, consuming, but it is a delay process that allows them to really give thought to it. Now, this does suggest that the most effective gun violence prevention policies that are currently in play are those that create a comprehensive verification system rather than just relying on one single checkpoint. And that is what we talk about when we talk about the quick at point of sale checks that some states have. Now, of course, we've heard now after the school shooting in Minneapolis, Minnesota last week, that you have people, including the President of the United States, that are coming on board and saying that arming educators could be a solution. Or is that a risk? Let's take a look at this, because at the end of the day, is a student who is disgruntled or upset, are they already going to know who the teachers are that are packing heat, so to speak? Or what about teachers if they misfire? What if they are not as calm in terms of the pressure situation of an active shooter as opposed to when they're just in front of the class writing on a whiteboard? Again, there's a lot of factors that play into this. And when there is a critical response going on, law enforcement are trained to deal with that, the emotions being suppressed to be able to focus on the task at hand. Whereas teachers don't have this training, nor do they get screened for this type of situation. Now, the different approach to school safety, of course, one focused on immediate response rather than prevention, is the proposal to arm the teachers, as I said, and other school staff. Now, this idea did gain renewed prominence following the Minneapolis school shooting, including, as I said, the president on September the 3rd, or sorry, the 2nd. Trump reiterated his long held support for the concept, suggesting that a small percentage of teachers with military or other distinguished firearms training should be permitted to carry guns in schools. Now, the debate over this proposal is deeply divided. Arguments for arming the teachers, let's take a look at that first. And that's proponents arguing that arming teachers could serve as a powerful deterrent, eliminating the gun-free zones that they believe attract attackers. They also contend that an armed staff member could neutralize a threat within seconds, where that becomes a critical advantage when police response times are measured in minutes. Now, a period during which the majority of casualties of an active shooter event occur could be reduced by a teacher or school person working on that as well. So again, when you look at the response time and the ability for a potential attacker to go forward with that, they could be reduced to maybe one area of the school as opposed to having access to a much broader scope of the facility. Now, furthermore, some see arming volunteers and volunteer teachers as a more cost-effective security measure than hiring full-time school resource officers, or SROs, in every school. But really, do we want the teachers to be taking up the position of being the police officers of the schools? I think that is a very tough decision. I also think it's a very slippery slope to go down. Now let's take a look at arguments against arming teachers, and opponents, including a vast majority of educators, law enforcement organizations, and school safety experts, raise numerous concerns. They argue that introducing more guns in a school environment inherently increases the risk of accidental shootings, suicides, or the weapon being stolen or taken by a student. They also stress that the level of training proposed for teachers is vastly insufficient to prepare them for the extreme stress and the tactical complexity of a real-world active shooter event. And let's not forget that even military members and those trained officers and such in law enforcement, when it comes to shooting someone on a battlefield, it is a far cry. Or in a crime situation, it's a far cry from being in a school and shooting a young student. Again, there is a big difference in the psychology of that and the fact that it could contribute more to the casualty count as opposed to reducing it. As I said, the real world scenarios are a big difference. Now, in a chaotic scenario, an armed teacher is more likely to hit a bystander or be misidentified by the law enforcement response as being, being an armed individual or an attacker as opposed to a school teacher who's responding to the incident. So again, they could be incidentally shot by police in a mistaken situation. Now, additionally, the critics also warn that the presence of armed teachers could create a climate of fear, and that, of course, can also impact the student-teacher trust and disproportionately affect students of color and students with disabilities who are already subjected to higher rates of school-based discipline and police referrals. Now, every student, whether it's in the United States or around the country, deserves and should have the right to a safe and inclusive environment within a school system. They should have the right to feel secure, to be able to focus on retaining the lessons that are being taught and the information being served. And instead, you have now an environment in many areas where students have the concerns about their safety, about active shooters, and so forth within the classroom that detracts from their ability to completely focus on the lessons at hand. Putting the guns in the hands of teachers may just contribute to a further distraction by students when it comes to the actual learning process. And as we've seen by statistics and numbers, the U.S. cannot afford for student test results or information retention to be reduced even further than it already is. Now, ultimately, the debate over arming teachers is not merely a tactical disagreement, but it's a proxy for a deeper ideological conflict, and that is about the nature of safety. The pro-arming stance reflects a worldview focused on hardening targets, assuming that the only effective response to the threat of violence is the immediate capacity for counter-violence. The anti-arming position embodies a public health approach that prioritizes prevention, de-escalation, and the preservation of nurturing learning environments. Now, the choice is not just about a policy, but about a kind of society and the kind of schools that we want for our children. That is a big question, and one that needs to be asked in all different levels of society. We've seen an increase in the number of attacks, whether it's in schools, whether it's at mass parades, like the event that happened in Vancouver last year, or of course incidents that happened much more recently at schools throughout the United States. We need to take a look at what we are teaching our children in the threat assessment or in the desensitization of the violence in itself. People turn and they point to the media, whether it's music, movies, video games, and online parts, to blame somebody. But at the same time, we need to be sure to look in the mirror, excuse me, when we are looking to place the blame. Now, one school of thought, supported by numerous studies over several decades, argues that there is a causal link and only a causal link. And that is when we took a look at the media effects. Now, this position holds that repeated exposure to simulated violence teaches aggressive behaviors and scripts, desensitizes viewers to the impact of real violence, and lowers empathy for victims. Now, according to the learning theory, the repetitive nature of playing a video violent game, for example, can reinforce aggressive tendencies more effectively than passive viewing. So again, it differentiates the different kinds of media. But at the same time, a violent video game is not going to convert a well-adjusted everyday child into a violent lunatic. Instead, what's going to happen is that when you have someone who may have a previous disposition or a predisposition to violence, it may act as a trigger and to move them forward in the ideation process. But again, it doesn't create a violent individual out of someone that is already well balanced. This is, of course, looking back at parents to decide what is appropriate for your child and what is not. It's not up to your kid's friends or his friends' parents to decide what video game your child should be playing. It's up to you to make an informed decision and to learn about it before you make those choices. Now, of course, there's the opposition and the counter evidence, and that's an opposing view that contends that this link is overstated and that most consumers of violent media are perfectly capable of distinguishing fantasy from reality. And as I said, this is true. The majority is much more in depth to look at the issues around violence and differentiate between the fantasy of what's on the screen and the reality of what's around them in the community. Again, it's really looking at the long-term studies and the different sides that are pointing to research, such as the fMRI studies that have found long-term exposure to violent video games does not lead to a significant reduction in the brain's empathy response to seeing others in pain. suggesting desensitization effect may be overstated, and I do agree with that. Proponents of this view argue that other factors, such as history of real world trauma and other mental illness contributors, are far more practical and powerful predictors of violent behavior. And that's something that we've gone through throughout the program tonight. Now, while academics debate over the different violence and the contributing factors, we need to press the reality that mental health comes down to almost every situation, and the destigmatization of mental health is being a weakness of someone reaching out for help, instead encouraging them and teaching people that it is okay to ask for help, to reach out if you are having negative thoughts, both about harming yourself or others. And that is important, because when we can destigmatize the reaching out for help and calling out for help publicly or within the peer circles and such, then we can reduce the acts of violence as well. We can identify and give these individuals tools to handle those thoughts and their problems that they are having. Now, we also look at the platforms of social media, the regular mainstream media, and others. And there is also a clear link between media coverage and the generalized imitation effect. And that, as experts have proposed, there's new standards that have come out for the press and social media platforms that help to deal with how these issues are reported and handled on the media stage. Now, the core recommendations from the organizations, such as the American Psychological Associations, is to deny the shooters the fame they crave. Again, when you look at people posting videos of violent acts on the internet, again, it's not necessarily that they are acting out in violence in order to harm someone else, but instead of this disengagement within the mental cortex or the thought process, in that they are going to post it online, they're going to become famous, they're going to get all of this attention, whether or not it is after a small act of violence, and no act is really small when it harms somebody else, but in terms of a smaller act of violence in that regard, as opposed to mass acts of violence and trying to create a legacy in perpetuity, you could almost say, and a very, very bad one at that. But again, you want to disclose the information in a responsible manner. So you don't want to name them, the attackers. You want to minimize or ideally completely avoid using the perpetrators' names and their photos. Is this why we haven't heard a lot about the shooter of Donald Trump? Again, that is a possibility, that they are trying to minimize the results of his actions. That is the shooter, the alleged shooter, and trying to minimize anybody mimicking or trying to gain fame by such actions. So again, keep in mind that there is a psychological and a process and a thought behind not glorifying these individuals, because again, we don't want to see that become a challenge for somebody else to come up with being, immortalized online. And when we look at shifting the focus, again, the center of the narrative should always be on the victims and their stories, the heroes who have emerged from the stories, and the resilience of the affected community. Why? Well, again, it takes away the focus from the individual. It doesn't make them famous. It doesn't make them infamous. It takes away that power that they are looking to achieve through these acts. So again, I hope that makes a bit of sense for people in terms of the context used. Now, you want to report responsibly. Again, we see people that are trying to maximize impact of the acts online for simply the purpose of gaining clicks, followers, and likes. And again, driving monetization to their channels. A big, big problem. What we need to do is make sure that we avoid sensationalizing the events, publishing the full text of manifestos, or providing detailed tactical descriptions of the attack. That could only serve in as a blueprint for other people in the future. So again, we don't want to be creating a legacy token We don't want to be ignoring the leaks of their plans. We want to be watching what's going on. We want to be aware and we want to be empowered. There's a book here called Youth Violence, an International Crisis, Fighting Violence by and Against Youth, but it also couples in a lot about video games and technological addictions to different things such as technology, phones, and so forth, but also a lot about how the different ways of identifying violence and predictable or warning indicators ahead of time that we don't have time to cover on a 1 hour program. So again, if you're interested in getting a copy of that book, you can always email smile at propixcanada.com. That's SMILE at propix, PROPCS, canada.com, or through the messaging here on the program, or of course the comment section on the rebroadcasts on most platforms. But let's just close it out here, folks, as we are out of time. The tragedies of 2025, from the mass school shooting in Minnesota to the streets of cities around the world. It's reinforcing a difficult but essential truth, and that is that mass violence is preventable. It is a public health crisis, and it is something we need to educate ourselves on. We want to avoid the conversation because it scares us to think that our children or ourselves are not safe in the communities and the areas where we work, live, and learn. So again, we need to come out of that comfort zone for a bit to learn about the warning signs. And remember, it is not an unpredictable anomaly, but the end point of a visible process. The pathway is marked by identifiable grievances, acute stressors, and a constellation of warning signs. Critically, in the vast majority of cases, those on this path communicate their intent to others before they act. Preventing these tragedies definitely requires a holistic, multi-layered approach, and it demands greater public awareness to recognize the warning signs and close the bystander intervention gaps, or the BIGs. Empowering friends, family, and colleagues to act with their concerns as opposed to just brushing it off. It requires the implementation of evidence-based policies such as firearms purchaser licenses, or FPLs, that create a more robust system for vetting those who seek to acquire deadly weapons, and it calls for a new standard of responsibility from the institutions, particularly media and social media platforms, to deny perpetrators the notoriety that they so often are motivated by. Once again, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Carry Movers Limited, Western Canada's top long-distance and local moving company, serving the Western Canada community for over 20 years. Carry Movers cares about your safety in the community in which we live, work, and of course support other programs. So if you want more information about moving locally in Metro Vancouver or the Fraser Valley, check out www.carrymovers.com. That's Kary movers.com, and also for your long distance moves throughout Western Canada. Once again, you have been tuned in to Primetime Live on Jess FM and Jess TV. We hope that you enjoyed this program. We hope that you've learned something. And by all means, pay attention to the program, because we will have future episodes on violence prevention, whether it's in relationships, workplaces, or other areas of life. We bring you this program every Thursday night at 8 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Don't forget that the phone lines are always open during the program. And if you'd like to call in after the program airs, you can do so as well and leave a voicemail that we may or may not air on future episodes. Once again, you've been watching Jess FM. Thank you for tuning in. Stay safe, everyone, and take care.